All right, I think we've got it now. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Michael Garcia. Michael Garcia joined Willis Towers Watson in 2015 as a thematic strategist. He divides his time between the Thinking Ahead group and advancing the firm's global asset class thematic investing capability. He has been exclusively engaged by the Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board from 2011 to 2015. He has prior experience at Nordea Capital Management in Copenhagen. And while at Nordea, he headed the Thematic Investment Strategy and Research capability, oversaw idea generation and coordination for $13 billion in assets under management, and served as co-portfolio manager for the firm's global equity portfolio. He's co-author of the Thematic Investment Process. He earned a BA in philosophy from Wheeling Jesuit University and an MA in European Studies from the Katholieke University in Belgium. He is also a visiting fellow at Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland. Everyone, please give a warm Atlanta welcome to Michael Garcia. Thank you.
Am I on? Can everyone hear me okay? Is it okay if I walk around as opposed to going up to the podium? Is that okay? Well, great. Thanks so much. I appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity. So just before we kick off, you heard a little bit about my background, but there's another story here. So I joined Legacy Towers Watson in June of last year. And being a former fund manager, an equity fund manager and an equity strategist, I've had the wonderful opportunity of sitting on the other side of the global consultants. And I'm sure there are a lot of independents in the room who've gone through consultant days before. So the really grueling process of due diligence, Spanish Inquisition, where the global consultants really turn the firm and the individuals into walking zombies. So when I had the opportunity to join Towers Watson to really advance the thematic initiative for the firm, I'd mentioned to my wife, could you imagine in your wildest dreams that I'd be joining the same firm that turned me into a zombie for over a decade? And she paused and said, you know, you're not in my wildest dreams. So with that, I'll just kind of kick off here. So I've had the opportunity to work with the Thinking Ahead group, which is Willis Towers Watson. Willis and Towers joined forces and merged in January of this year. I belong to the Thinking Ahead group and also head up the thematic investing process across the firm. So within this context, the Thinking Ahead group is really purposed to take a look at some of these issues, the longer horizon issues of relevance across the industry itself. Within that context, Best Practice Investment Committee is really a standout. So before we get started, maybe if I can just ask a question. Is anyone in this room currently a sitting or a standing member of an investment committee? Okay, not that many. Now, throughout your careers, who has been involved with investment committees throughout the years? Again, we have the room, basically. So we would say, we would contend that investment committees are a natural part of our industry, and specifically, they're going to be a natural part of the success of the industry going forward. Many are good, very few are great. And so the research that I'm going to be speaking to today and the ideas that I'm going to share with you today are really based upon a lot of the research that was conducted by the Thinking Ahead group, but they really build upon the research that was conducted by Roger Irwin and Gordon Clark. Roger Irwin is also a colleague of mine when it comes to investment committees and the governance within that context itself. So to start off, so no man or no one has ever erected a monument to a committee, but there's logic to that. There is absolute historic rationale. Typically, what we've seen is that committees have really been created on an ad hoc basis. They've been created and they've been executed on an ad hoc basis. There's been no true systematic process for moving them to really reach the ambitions or the strategic ambitions of the overall organization, whether it's a fund, whether it's an organization, whether it's an endowment itself. There have been a lot of structural impediments. There's been no true understanding of strategic direction. There's been a lacking of competency with regard to the committee itself or the group. There's been no true dedicated or committed chair, and we'll speak about that today. So actually, a lot of this information, a lot of the slides that I'm going to be speaking to really build upon Martin's comments in the last presentation itself. So there is reason for the structural impediments to exist, and there's reason to think that we can actually get better. Now, the challenges that we've seen historically aren't going to get any easier. We are true believers that we live in a complex adaptive system and that markets are increasingly becoming more complex. We often use the phrase, the acronym VUCA. Is anyone familiar with VUCA? So VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. VUCA is an acronym that was coined by the National Defense College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, at the start of the Cold War, to really give an understanding of what multipolarity looks like, so what a multipolar world looks like and how challenging it's going to be. And we think it rings with alarming clarity with regard to the market. So we have changing market technologies, we have changing market participants, we have changing markets themselves, the ability to adapt to regime shifts. So these challenges are still with us, but one constant that we do believe we're going to have is that we're going to have to take decisions within this context. And decisions we've taken. And increasingly, what we're seeing is that a lot of those decisions are very value destructive, to the tune of close to 80 basis points over 3 years. Now, in a world where we're going to be facing constrained returns, compressed returns for 5%, 80 basis points resonates with different meaning. Now, this is an interesting chart, and I'm sure we've all been part of this. So if I can maybe ask another question. Who in this room has been part of a process, part of a committee, which has fired a manager due to exhibiting poor past performance? Okay. Now, who in the room has been part of a process where they've hired a manager for exhibiting positive past performance? Okay, very similar. It's interesting because we know what the literature says. We know the literature, the body of literature suggests that it's virtually impossible to hire a manager who can consistently outperform throughout all market regimes across all cycles. Okay. It's been proven it's virtually impossible to hire a manager who can outperform consistently, but yet we still take these types of decisions. We fall victim to the recency bias. We fall victim to the hot hand fallacy. I have 2 children. One's 14, one's 12. The 14-year-old plays basketball and soccer. The 12-year-old, she plays field hockey. They are absolutely superstitious. So they truly believe in the hot hand. So my son, if he feeds a ball to a forward who hits 8 out of 10 shots, he's feeding it to him again because of the hot hand. Yet we know that these variables are independent of each other. They're absolutely independent, but yet time and time again, we take these decisions. We fire managers, we hire managers for past performance, and at the end of the day, it turns into value destruction close to 80 basis points. So maybe just to put into context, my first engagement or my first encounter with an investment committee. So I went to school in Belgium, and I studied international relations. One of my classes that I had was taught by a professor who was a Czech national. Do we have any Czech speakers in the room? Okay, it's not uncommon to get that answer. He was actually teaching us a course on linguistics, and linguistics as it relates to the formation of cultural and national identity, how language plays a role in identity itself. And there was a word that he used that was fundamental to the Czech society and to Czech identity. The word was litost, L-I-T-O-S-T. But he said it's untranslatable into English, but yet forms the basis of identity of a Czech national, okay? But he couldn't translate it. So soon after the course began, he was invited to join the investment committee for the university's endowment. And he was a really lively individual, really passionate, but after he joined the investment committee, he would come into the course really devoid of any energy. He was a skeleton of his former self. And until one day he came in and it had crystallized in the investment committee. He now understood how to translate that word that was so fundamental to Czech identity, how to translate litost. Litost is loosely translated into English as misery and self-loathing. Misery and self-loathing, formation of check identity. And he had actually, it had crystallized in the meeting because the misery was largely due to the engagement with the committee members. He couldn't, it was unbearable. And self-loathing because he recognized, he seriously recognized that his competencies and the competencies of the committee were not aligned with the strategic direction of the endowment and what the endowment needed. Now, he knew what he didn't know. Many of us, I'd be the first to admit, don't know what we don't know. So in the process of doing some research, we started to ask ourselves, is there a way to think through best practice investment committee? Is there a way to actually categorize several different areas where we could focus with clients in order to take that investment committee and create a step change in value and to really align it with the strategic direction of the organization of the fund? And we believe there are. We believe there are 4. So role, composition, process, and culture. Role, quite simply, the spectrum or continuum of responsibilities and accountabilities across the committee, and specifically as it relates to the executive team. Okay. Composition, again, quite simply, who's been selected, why have they been selected, what type of value add do they introduce to the committee itself. Process is the decision-making rights across the committee, and specifically how that translates into the executive team itself, or potentially an external partner. And then culture, mission, values, beliefs, and specifically how trust is engendered across the committee itself and then translated back into the executive team. So what I thought I'd do today is really just give you an understanding of what we would consider to be the top 10 leading attributes of a best practice IC. So just a word of caution, this isn't, it's not in the spirit of David Letterman, it's not in the spirit of the late night show, so it's not a reverse countdown, it's just 10 of the leading attributes that we thought we'd share with you today. So number 1, best practice investment committee has a strategic focus. So they understand the needs of the organization and they take a view that all actions within the committee itself should be aligned with the strategic direction of the firm, of the organization, of the fund. They know where they need to head, they know what needs to be accomplished, and they also know in which time frame that needs to be accomplished within. They have mission clarity, they have a line of sight and a direction of travel. Number 2, a best practice investment committee delegates. They understand that everyone delegates. It's just a matter of to what degree. Okay? They understand their role is to get things done, but not always to do it themselves. So the investment committee, do they hire a competent CIO and build up an executive team? Possibly. Or do they work with an outsourced CIO model and delegate to an external partner? Also an option. Again, focusing on getting things done, but not always having an understanding that you need to accomplish it yourself. Number 3, effective management and oversight. So we really think of this in terms of 3 different words: balancing, linking, and promoting. So balancing, the best practice ICs that we've seen understand that it's about balancing performance and compliance. They understand that it's about linking the key drivers to all the actions that they take, linking those to the employees themselves, to the processes which are embedded into the organization, and also linking them to the end users in the context of a defined benefit plan. So linking them to the end users with regard to positive outcomes themselves. And then promoting accountability and promoting responsibility, again, within the committee, but then also the executive team. Number 4, competent and diligent members. This is really quite simply, this is Jim Collins. This is getting the right people on the bus, if you know the phrase, getting the wrong people off the bus, I think that's my favorite, and then getting the right people into the right seats. Okay, best practice IC understands the role of competitive advantage. They understand how important that is. So when it comes to the selection of members for a committee, why are you selected? What domain expertise do you have? What value add are you introducing into that process, into that committee, in order to drive it towards the strategic needs of the organization? That competitive advantage is absolutely critical. Number 5, sized appropriately. So this is really interesting. Is everyone familiar with Jeff Bezos from Amazon, his 2 pizza rule? Okay, so Jeff Bezos says that no committee or no group should be large enough where it can't be fed by 2 pizzas. Okay? So 2 pizzas should be able to, now effectively that's roughly 5 to 7 people in our experience. So the 2 pizzas really, it's a powerful concept because being sized appropriately means that you have depth and breadth of competitive advantage and competencies, but it's small enough where you can actually drive towards decisions, and that's key. That's key, driving towards action, driving towards those types of decisions to affect positive outcomes across the organization. Number 6, a chair sets direction and facilitates best practice. So we like to think of this through the acronym IDEA, I-D-E-A. So a best practice chair is capable of influencing not just the committee, not just each member, but the committee in aggregate, but also the executive team and/or external partners. Okay. D, directs, is capable of directing and facilitating decision-making and driving towards action. Okay. Absolutely critical. E, engages. This is interesting, and we'll touch on this when I talk about cognitive diversity itself. Engages. So a best practice chair understands that everyone in the committee needs to be engaged, not just the dominant voices, and there will always be a dominant voice. And in fact, literature and research would suggest that in committee or group settings, the first person to speak sets the tone of the meeting. The first person to speak sets the tone of ideas and directionality for decisions. So a best practice chair is capable of engaging the less vocal, the less dominant voices and drawing out contribution to create a balanced environment itself. And then A, acts, and acts as a strategic and a dynamic liaison, again, across the committee, but with the external managers and/or the executive team. So acts as a real dynamic liaison. What we're also finding within this is that a best practice chair spends 3 times the amount of time on the committee with regard to either research or contribution at the committee level than a regular member. 3 times the amount. Number 7, diverse thinking and unified decisions. So we've heard a lot about it today, specifically we've heard about diversity. We've heard about it in the video itself. Jim spoke about it. We heard Mayor Reed speak about diversity. It's a critical point, but there's more to diversity than what we would term to be surface diversity. So surface diversity is that which you can see. Okay, race, gender, age. There's more to diversity. Okay, there's something that's called deep diversity. Deep diversity is difference in opinions, difference in thought, difference in perspectives. In German, the word is Weltanschauung, meaning worldview, how you view the world and how you engage with the world. That's a critical point when it comes to diversity. Here, we're speaking about cognitive diversity. So cognitive diversity is how you think. We've been taught that that how an individual forms opinions is largely based upon left brain, right brain. Has everyone heard that? You're either left brain or you're right brain individual. What we're finding now is it's top and lower brain. Left brain, right brain isn't necessarily as indicative of decision making as top brain and lower brain. So cognitive diversity really falls across 3 different areas. It falls across verbal reasoning, which is largely exhibited by lawyers, for instance. There's spatial visualization, which is really characterized by engineers and architects. And then there's object visualization, largely exhibited by artists or graphic designers. Okay? So what's the punchline? Why does this matter? And it matters because we've seen that diverse groups outperform. And we heard about it today. So women, larger groups of women actually outperform those of larger groups of men. And in fact, what the study would show is that the best performing team is comprised of all women and 1 man. So again, there's hope for us. There's hope. So 1 man. But what we've seen is that, but cognitive diversity is really about forming an opinion that you're populating the group with different thinkers because you're not going to all get stuck on the same problem. And if you do get stuck in the same problem, okay, you won't get stuck in the same area of the problem. And this is really important when we're working within a VUCA environment or a complex adaptive system where we have to take decisions based upon directionality of markets and our opinions. So having those different thoughts, having that different perspective is really additive to an overall committee. Number 8, well-grounded principles. This is, and we've heard about it in the video today, shared purpose. If we go back to legacy investment committees on an ad hoc basis, we find that there wasn't a true meaning. There wasn't a true level of enforceability. Yes, they understood they had to take a decision, but there wasn't meaning attached to it. Best practice ICs today, we're finding that there is a clear understanding of meaning, a clear understanding of purpose, a clear understanding of enforceability and how they're driving towards decisions and what those decisions need to be taken, under what time frame and how they should be taken. So there's a clear understanding of, within each member, their meaning, and then in aggregate, the meaning of the committee itself. And these are falling both within financial concerns and financial considerations, but increasingly we're seeing that non-financial considerations are also being incorporated into these types of principles. Number 9, effective and balanced governance framework. So this really goes back to role, composition, process, and culture. And it really speaks to responsibilities, accountabilities, and measurement. So we use the phrase, I'm sure you've heard it before, that which gets measured gets managed. This is important because you can have those responsibilities, you can have those accountabilities, but you might not have key performance indicators in order to measure the directionality and the effectiveness of those responsibilities and accountabilities. So best practice IC uses those KPIs or key performance indicators or other levels of measurement to really track and to hold accountable those individuals which are responsible for actions. Again, that which gets measured gets managed. And number 10, strong and positive culture. Again, this goes back to values, it goes back to belief, it goes back to mission. But we're also seeing that a best practice IC understands that part of that culture is collaboration. It's focused on integrity, it's focused on excellence, driving, trying to get better. We've increasingly seen the use of, we've all heard of postmortems, right? So postmortems after a decision's taken, let's go back and understand what went right, what went wrong. We're also starting to see the increased use of premortems. And so premortems are before a decision is taken, for instance, the hiring of a manager. The best practice IC will work with all of the members to get a better understanding of, let's fast forward the tape 3 years. Let's fast forward the tape 5 years. This decision has gone horribly wrong. What's happened? What assumptions do we have to make today that this manager underperforms, that a crisis occurs, that there's a negative outcome or an outcome that falls outside of the scope of our decision making today? What's happened? Let's get an understanding of that and see if we can mitigate those types of risks. So those premortems are increasingly used and embedded into the natural part of the culture. But we're also seeing that there's a tendency to celebrate. Because we're operating in such difficult, challenging, uncertain environments, a lot of decisions we recognize, a lot of decisions do go wrong, but a lot of decisions go right. And those best practice ICs celebrate those small wins because it becomes a natural part of the organizational DNA and a natural part of the organizational memory, which then creates a positive feedback loop with regard to how that culture is extended through the organization itself. So again, no one has built a monument, we recognize that, but we think we can. We think we're working with clients in such a way as to actually see if we can streamline these processes in such a way as to create best practice. Now, we've had a number of clients who have come up to us just recently, and they've said, we understand the attributes, we understand the characteristics of best practice, but with regard to the contingencies, it's very hard to implement. And at the end of the day, it comes down to how we're going to implement, how we're actually going to gain traction by taking that next step towards action. How do we do that? Taking into account the myriad and host of contingencies. How do we account for all of those contingencies? And I don't know if anyone's familiar with, does anyone know the name Astro Teller from, it used to be Google X, now it's X. So Google X is the moonshot factory for Google. So they're responsible for Google Glass, Loon. They're also responsible for the driverless car. Is everyone familiar with the driverless car? So Astro Teller tells this story about contingencies, and he says that at one point several years ago, the driverless car is on the road in Palo Alto when all of the engineers are behind their desks watching the car maneuver and navigate the streets. When it comes around a corner and comes to a dead stop, and the engineers can't believe what they see on the screens. In front of the car is an old woman in a mobility scooter with a broom swatting a duck across the street. Okay? Now, luckily, the car came to a dead stop. One of the engineers turns to the other and says, Susan, why didn't you build that into the algorithm? Right? And so this just gives us, it gives us an understanding that we will always face these contingencies. We will always face contingencies that are non-existent. There are unknown unknowns. But what we've found more and more is that there's something to be extremely excited about to take that first step, to take the first step towards building something unique and trying to get better within the operational framework of a committee itself. No, we know we won't account for all of the contingencies, but taking that first step is critical. So with that, I will close. But thank you very much. I think we might have time for a few questions. I think we have 5 minutes. If there are any questions, yeah.
I was listening to your presentation, not just about investment committee, but
Sure.
committees in general. And so if you have this diverse group of people that eventually reach a decision,
Right.
what happens when the door opens? Because people have had to compromise their values or they've had to compromise their belief, I don't know, figure, fill in the blank.
Sure.
In order to reach this consensus, right, in order to get the take. So when the door opens, is the board, part of the board responsibility to then present a united front, or to let people know, well, these are all of the decisions, these are all of the pros and cons that we weighed and we came out like this?
Right. So it's a fantastic question. And what we've seen is probably on the latter, that in driving towards a unified decision, it's especially within a cognitively diverse group, let's assume it's 5 to 7, it's very rare where everyone shares the same opinion going into an issue, going into a decision itself. We have seen that if it's 5, and we like odd numbers because you can drive towards a decision as opposed to split decisions at 4 or 6. We found that there is compromise. Now, you used the word belief, compromise of belief. I don't know if we've seen a compromise of belief. There is, going back to premortems and postmortems, what we find is strong arguments, empirically evidenced arguments, logical arguments have a tendency to win. We also find that a plan is better than no plan. So going into a decision, understanding, doing the homework, understanding all of the issues that could be discussed and forming opinions based on those is critical. And so we found that the best practice I see is all of the members understand that at some point in time, their opinion, their view might not win the day, but they view themselves as trusted and valued members of the committee. And with regard to that, those unified fronts, whether it's operating at the trustee level or at the board level, or taking that decision and then playing it back to the executive team as a unified front is critical. And so we would talk about how that trust is engendered. So you might be in a situation where your opinion isn't as vocal or isn't as represented within the final decision, but you also recognize how much of a trusted member of that committee you are simply by adding that perspective into the group itself. But that unified front is critical. Yeah.
The first person that speaks sets the tone. It seems to me that oftentimes
That's right.
studies into personality or characteristics of the chair that would, like if you have somebody who's overly aggressive or domineering, and done studies to suggest what type of characteristics and personalities usually would be the best type of chair.
We're actually doing that currently with regard to personality types. But what we found is there are a lot of differences between chairs. So instead of us migrating towards identifying the differences, we're trying to level set the conversation, identify of the best practice chairs that we've seen, what are the commonalities? And one of the commonalities that really rises to the top quickly is very dynamic, ability to direct decision making, but rather subdued. So the balance of the committee is vocal. The chair eventually and ultimately has the final say, but the chair is very subdued with regard to voicing opinion. So trying to create a balanced environment. So we have a number of different personalities that can operate within that, but that commonality is really just taking a step back, doing more listening than speaking, and being subdued to actually drive decisions across the membership base, and actually just picking up, trying to empower the rest of the committee to take those decisions and to work out an opinion and to work out a view relative to actually enforcing that view. Yeah.
That chart that you had up earlier.
Yep.
In regards to bias, the hot dot.
Yeah.
Since that's a well-documented behavior, do you find that investment committees now are becoming a lot more patient with managers, performance or lack thereof?
Sorry for.
And even the tendency for them to push back a little bit if their
Yep.
portfolio manager wants to make the change too soon?
I would go one step further. So yes is the answer. We're definitely seeing this. And increasingly we're finding a number of, whether it's corporate pension funds or specifically defined benefit plans in North America and then on a global basis, which are pursuing permanent capital. So with a recognition that the manager, depending upon style, depending upon strategy, how that implementation is occurring across cycles, across regimes, there will be underperformance. At some point in time, the market will not pay for that strategy. Okay. If the board, if the trustee, if the committee recognizes that, but you wholeheartedly feel that that is the best manager, why not lock it up? And so what we've discussed, and we have, I'm a member of the Thinking Ahead group, but we also have what's called the Thinking Ahead Institute. And the Thinking Ahead Institute it's an initiative to bring together asset managers and asset owners at scale. Currently we have 39 members with close to 12 trillion under management across that base in order to talk about these issues and to explore best practice. What can we do? And so we just had a roundtable event where we talked about, we termed it a long-term mandate. And a long-term mandate is essentially, instead of working and judging performance, engaging performance on an annual basis, and obviously we probably all have stories about that, it's not locking it up for 3 years, it's not locking it up for 5 years, it's locking it up for 7 years on a rolling basis, with an understanding that we don't want that. We don't want loss. We understand the nature, we understand the perspective, we understand the strategy of the manager, and that's what we're attempting to lock up. So it's a 7-year rolling basis. So I think, yeah, absolutely. Yes, sir.
On the thought of pre-mortem and also thinking ahead, as you talked about,
Right.
as it relates to defined benefit pension plans, what are your thoughts as it relates to the actuary who says you can have a 7 to 8% actuarial assumption for your pension fund moving forward?
What are my thoughts on that? So we would contend, and this is absolutely open for debate. I think 7 to 8% realistically has a tendency to gravitate towards the high end. We're forecasting, and it is just a forecast, absolutely subject to discussion and debate. We're looking at 4 to 5% going forward, if this literature holds true, if this empirical evidence holds true, 4 to 5% long-term return, assuming a traditional 60-40, 80 basis points, again, has a different type of meaning. So I think that would be, but again, that's me. I'm not speaking for the firm. I think 7 to 8% has a tendency to be high. Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of the cognitive decision-making and that diversity aspect, obviously the studies show the positive impact overall with returns. Have you all nailed it down to the positive effects as it relates to just the risk profile of those decision-making, that final decision-making has been shown that also decreases the risk profile?
The risk profile of the fund?
Of the fund, of even the decision itself. So yeah, obviously it can be related to the fund itself, but there could be other areas.
We haven't. It's an interesting question. So what we've actually, the research that we've done is really based upon outcomes. So what's a natural outcome from different tasks? So the cognitive diversity research is based upon whether it's a highly process-driven task or a highly outcome-driven task, and then using different levels of cognitive diversity, whether it's all verbal reasoners, all spatial visualization individuals, to come and to operate within that task, as opposed to actually using all three, versus whether it's a process or an outcome-driven. So it's really based upon what that outcome is relative to the risks that are incurred within the process. But that would be really interesting to take a look into. Yeah.
I'm not familiar with the study. I was wondering if you could say why the group of women, what's the dynamic at play with a group of women that makes it superior to?
So what it suggests is higher levels of collaboration.
So do they naturally bring together a more diverse cognitive group than
There seems to be, the research suggests that collaboration is based upon a balanced role-taking, as opposed to a dominant voice. And what's interesting is the reverse of that is the worst performing group that we've seen is a 5 to a 7 group of male CEOs. And if you take the 5 to 7, remove one, and add a female executive assistant, the performance increases by close to 30%.
So it's predominantly collaboration.
It is collaboration. It's collaboration, but it is role-taking. It's the ability to listen, which isn't necessarily, I'm sorry to say, which isn't necessarily present with a lot of the males. To that group. Absolutely. It's just in this instance, it was all males. It was a loaded question because they did all males to really get an understanding of how poorly they did perform.
No, I understand, but your suggestion was to remove one of the males and add a female executive assistant. And I said, why wouldn't you add a
You certainly could.
CEO?
Absolutely. This was just the research that was conducted. That was the addition and subtraction that they did. Oh, absolutely. You could definitely do it. Sure.
But you also made the point that an all-female group with one male added was the best.
Was the best performing group.
And what characteristic do you think the single male brought to the picture that was beneficial?
Citing the research, it was the ability to drive to action. So there's heightened levels of collaboration, but in an all-female collaborative group relative to a dominantly female with one male, high levels of collaboration, but not as action-oriented relative to the addition of the man. Yeah.
What about the top brain versus lower brain impact on decision making? You mentioned that briefly.
Right, so that's how the cognitive diversity is actually shaping up. So top brain, when it comes to verbal reasoning, spatial visualization, and object visualization, it comes from different lobes of the brain. And what was previously understood as being left brain, right brain, wasn't necessarily taking into account this type of research, which recognizes that it's not necessarily, are you an architect or an engineer, or are you quantitatively driven or qualitatively driven, versus that there's a spectrum that exists across that, especially with regard to architects. Very quantitative, but they also have tendencies to think in terms of artistic capabilities when it comes to design. So what we're now finding is that it's not a left brain, right brain. It's more the different lobes which are actually driving the ability to engage your world and what drives that type of thinking and decision making. Yeah.
I was just going to say, with regard to this chart comment about the actuary who thought 7 to 8% return was fine, I think occasionally when people who just have their own interest at heart. I mean, because it may be hard to keep your job historically.
Absolutely.
If you're retaining underperforming managers for very long.
Absolutely.
And doing a search and looking for a new manager, you're busy, you're doing something.
That's right.
And you're making a change, and even though a lot of people in the industry may be well aware that that's not likely to necessarily work out,
Yep.
you want to keep your job. And the same thing with the actuary who's doing the telling his client what his client wants to hear, you want to keep your job. So,
I think you're spot on. I think you're spot on. So we've had recent conversations, and there was one. He was the CIO of a $6 billion Canadian fund, and we talked to him about this and long-term mandates specifically. And what he said was, if he has a manager that underperforms on a quarter, he receives an email. If he has that manager underperforming for 2 quarters, there's an email with suggestions in bulleted format for remedial action. God forbid that manager underperforms throughout the year. Now you're running career risk. Okay. So I think you're absolutely spot on. The second is, what this also speaks to is the political influence, and the political influence either at the board level or the ability of politicians within a defined benefit plan to have influence on the directionality of the fund. If they want their fingerprints on the fund, right, if they want to change the lineup where they don't understand the rationale or logic for why that lineup exists, they have the ability, either he or she has the ability to exert that type of influence. So that political influence is definitely embedded into this process. This is not simply just 5 to 7 members of an investment committee who continue to take poor decision making. There are a lot of externalities which are embedded into this process. So I've just been given 2 minutes. So is there anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering whether there was a difference if you had an outsider. I mean, I'm assuming that in a typical committee of the kind that I think you're describing, you have people who have expertise in alternatives, equities, fixed income, representatives of all the major things. And of course, everybody comes to that with their own assumptions, not only about their own area, but about other people's areas as well.
Absolutely.
And if you have an outsider who will say from time to time, that's not clear, does that help?
So that dynamic. So sorry. So the question is whether or not an independent view would be additive to a process, as opposed to having, whether it's members of an executive team, I'm paraphrasing, but whether it's members of an executive team, part of an investment committee, who might have not only dominant views upon their area of influence, but also areas outside of their expertise who might be able to exert that type of influence, whether an independent view would add value. We've definitely seen that with regard to boards, and with regard to boards, and increasingly we're starting to see investment committees for some funds or some plans which might be underscaled or under-resourced, who have the ability to introduce an independent voice, trying to recruit and retain that type of independent voice. I don't know if there's enough. We haven't seen enough data in the system right now to gauge whether that's been effective. but suggestions would indicate that it is more additive than not.
Do you work with endowments as well as pensions?
We do.
You'd be more likely to find that there.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'm sorry, I've just been given the wrap up. Happy to take it offline. Thank you. Thank you very much.